Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. I occasionally troll the internet for podcasts that might be interesting to my audience. My audience doesn't seem to have much of an interest in subjects like general relativity or organized crime, but the podcasts, when I discuss various aspects of the occult, do very well. So today is one of those days. I came across Robert Frederick's podcast, The Hidden Life is Best. And although some of his ideas are certainly out there, I was impressed by his free thinking and all the books he's read to support his ideas. There's something to be said for free thinking and reading books. And as I said, the name of his podcast is The Hidden Life is Best. And he is so into hiding that he's going to retain his physical anonymity throughout this interview. How you doing, Robert?
I'm doing very well, Nick. Thank you.
Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm sorry, I have a little tickle in my throat. Excuse me. I'm doing very well, and it's an honor to be here, Nick. I really respect the work that you're doing, and thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. And you've written quite a bit about Francis Bacon. Actually, you've delved into so many different crevices about Francis Bacon. You might be the only true Francis Bacon scholar in the world, considering most Francis Bacon scholars are academics. And Francis Bacon, in case my audience didn't know, lived from 1561 to 1626. And he was an English philosopher and statesman who served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England under Queen Elizabeth and King James I. How did you develop your fascination into Francis Bacon, Robert?
Well, first of all, I'm certain there are three major non-academic Bacon scholars, and but I'll just want to say that I'm certainly not at the top. I have an original take on him that comes from my kind of conspiratorial viewpoint on the world. And what happened was I was looking for the source of the world's major ills, being that people I meet and what I know about humans. And most of us are fair-minded and reasonable people, but the world is always in such bad shape. I started to get a sense that maybe there was a hidden hand behind everything, and I always shut that conversation down immediately in my head because, of course, it's preposterous to think there's a large hidden hand. But I started to zoom in on the British Empire because it seemed like wherever they have gone in the world, there's major problems in that part of the world, and they've been almost everywhere, all over the world. So I was kind of focusing on the British Empire. Francis Bacon came up because of his he's credited with kickstarting modern science, and I had begun to see science as a religion, and a lot of quote unquote solutions being given to us were based on a scientism, like an overzealous faith in science. And he was on my radar, and then I heard that he was suspected of being William Shakespeare. And I had this wild synchronicity one day around Francis Bacon. I thought, well, I have to look at Francis Bacon. And it was sort of like stumbling on an odd shape in the ground and pushing the earth away from this odd shape and discovering, this ancient, incredible structure. Let's say a building. You discover a hidden building. Bacon's really into buildings. That's the symbolism of Freemasonry. And I got in there, and sure enough, he definitely was William Shakespeare, and he was also the source of science. He's considered one of the greatest lawyers in English history. He was involved in espionage and intelligence, essentially helped start MI5. He was there right at the very beginning of MI5, maybe not the very, very beginning, but right there with the big names, Francis Walsingham, William Cecil. And what really astonished me is that there were people saying that he was the one that coalesced all the symbolism of modern Freemasonry together, and that Freemason really began under Francis Bacon. And so my mind was completely blown and my life was changed. And I did start to read about Francis Bacon obsessively. And it just grows into this huge topic because it's the English Empire, it's Shakespeare, it's intelligence, it's uh, you know, colonialism. What really triggered me was hearing a podcast that Francis Bacon was involved in the settling of Jamestown, Virginia. And Virginia is named after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth. And also Tudor London was just an incredibly fascinating place. And you start to understand why people are fascinated with the Tudors and English history, which I never really cared about. But I sure do know a whole lot about that period of time. And so I started my podcast as a way to start to get this information out while I write a book about all of this.
What's interesting to me about Bacon and being an intelligence agent is his contemporary, John Dee, who was also a big time occultist, was also in intelligence. And way down the road, Aleister Crowley, who's a big time occultist, would also be part of British intelligence.
Yes. The reason I got so obsessive about this is because the tie-ins to what's happening today are so numerous and so strong and so obvious and real. And yeah, and the occult, John Dee, Aleister Crowley, intelligence, CIA, assassinations, and also entertainment, the kind of the perversity and the degradation of culture via entertainment and pedophilia, what you work on. It's all right there in merry old England in the Tudor era, which we like to think of as a very lovely time. It had lovely music and fabrics and all of that. And I'm just regularly astonished at the parallels to the present day that seem to me to have been purposefully formed back then.
And you say that he founded essentially three religions: scientism, Freemasonry, and Shakespeare, which all three could be considered religions. Let's focus a little bit on science. What are your thoughts about Sir Francis and science?
Okay. Now, this is what he's most known for as a philosopher of science. And of course, science has always existed and started to be talked about in earnest by the Greeks, uh, Aristotle specifically, but also Plato. And, philosophers of science have written a lot about science. But what's astonishing about Francis Bacon is he was an incredible prodigy. He was an incredibly gifted child who was given the best possible education and went off to Trinity College at the age of 12, which wasn't unusual back then. But he dropped out at the age of 14, announcing he was bored. And rumors were that he had read pretty much every book possibly you could get your hands on in England by the time he was 18 or 19. But at 14, almost 15, he announced he was bored and he was going to challenge Aristotle. And he felt that Plato and Aristotle were not progressive enough and that their philosophy just led to endless disputations over minor, meanings of words and ideas about the world. And what's astonishing about that prediction, and this is mainstream Baconian scholarship, is that he turned it into a reality, but let's see, 30 years later, at the age of 44, he wrote a book called The Advancement of Learning. And learning is science in Latin. And he followed that 15 years later with the book that they consider to have kickstarted modern science called Novum Organum, which is Latin for new method. And what he did was essentially challenge deductive reasoning of the Greeks, which is where you have a syllogism such as Socrates is a man, all men are born of woman, therefore Socrates was born of a woman, and it proves logically something is true. He said we need to focus on inductive reasoning, where you gather data and make inferences from all the data. It's not proof. You could always all swans are white. Every swan I've ever seen, 1,000 swans are white. All swans are white. Well, there could be a black swan in the future, which would then change your thinking into almost all swans are white. But let's just go with all swans are white because it becomes useful and change and he it was much more than that he wrote about, because he also had to challenge the general philosophical climate of the day, which could be resistant to, like, too much knowledge is a dangerous thing, the myth of Icarus, and various Christian ideas about knowledge and reality. But he was very, very successful in his philosophy, and those two books especially. And 20 years later, along came Descartes. Descartes was influenced by Francis Bacon. And most of the philosophers that immediately followed were heavily influenced by Francis Bacon. People like Rousseau, even Kant, who was further down the line, of course. But then what's really remarkable is the first organization in the world ever to group together and focus on science is called the Royal Society for Improvement of Natural Knowledge, which started in London in 1660. Actually started in a more secret way in the 1640s during the Civil War. But they publicly say Francis Bacon is our Moses. We started this because of Francis Bacon. And one of the key things that cements Bacon's place as the father of modern science is he said, share your data, which is a very good thing. Instead of these alchemists in their little labs with their secret formulas trying to make gold, which he made fun of them, he said, let's share our data. Instead of you solo trying to get famous and rich, and they did. And these scientists got together in London. I guess they started Cambridge, but they in London, and sure enough, the technological revolution began and life forever changed. Like, as I say somewhere in the podcast, the line between ancient and modern goes through Francis Bacon, because that changed the world. And that's one of the reasons the English Empire got so powerful, is because they had the best technology, because of Francis Bacon urging science, which really he meant technology. That word didn't exist, but he kept saying progress for the relief of man's estate. But if you ever go to London, you got to go to the Science Museum, and it's really amazing what the English and the Scots came up with together, and that fueled the Industrial Revolution, which began in London. And what I found is that almost everything important, a huge percentage of what has changed the world, or what's important in the world now, came out of London, and it started right around that time. And a few of those things would be like English is the kind of the world's language. There's a lot of examples like that. The world sport is soccer, that began in England. But as far as science, Bacon is the man, and I think there's probably few things that have changed the world as much as technology, and that's Bacon.
When I was a philosophy student back in my youth, I had to read Rene Descartes. And I went to my one of my professors and I said, this guy is so boring, he could stop a charging rhino. And I said, why am I reading Rene Descartes? And my professor said, well, he started the scientific method and discourse on method. So, and Descartes and Bacon were contemporaries. And I think both of them, I, I don't know for sure, but you're positing that Bacon was a predecessor of Descartes.
Yeah. Descartes read Bacon. Bacon didn't read Descartes. Bacon was 20 years younger. Bacon actually corresponded with Galileo. The thing about Bacon is that he wasn't a very good scientist, but he saw what it meant. And this is Bacon's most famous statement. And this is why he started modern science, because it was already happening in London. Knowledge is power. What Bacon wanted was power. He wanted empire. He wrote on empire. And he was a crummy scientist, although he wrote very well about it. And he gave examples of how to think inductively and how to come to conclusions that weren't using, how to think inductively, that weren't using deductive reasoning. And he really inspired people to think in this new way that wasn't necessarily proof, but could lead to something useful. And Descartes read Bacon, and then Bacon's star has sort of fallen because he didn't actually invent, he didn't use the word hypothesis and this whatever these details of the method, but it's most scholars agree that Bacon is the man, and that is what he's known as. And not only that, what gets really more amazing is this double volume book on the Enlightenment I have here, and you'll see this elsewhere, Wikipedia and wherever, is that he's considered the guiding light of the Enlightenment. Not the guiding light, what's the word? The patron saint of the Enlightenment. A lot of people point to him as the origin of the Enlightenment, which is astonishing because, in a way, he was living still in the medieval time. I mean, when Bacon was born and a young man, they were still jousting. Knights would joust for the Queen in Westminster on the Thames while Bacon was a young man. It was the Renaissance, especially in Italy, but it had come to London late. And Bacon started the Enlightenment. So he really straddled three major eras of mankind. And I think he's the only one you could say did that. And it's really true that his impetus radically changed the world. And a few people have come to this conclusion too. It's not just me that's saying this. It's just that he wasn't, I don't know, he's just not as famous for various reasons, not as famous as Descartes or John Locke or other people in the history of science. Or he also did made no major discoveries, even though he's claimed that he did science and had a place, a workshop. And the ironic thing is, even though I call him the smartest and most influential man who ever lived, he was completely wrong, or as you might say, Nick, he whiffed on some pretty major things happening at his time. And just to give you an example of the brilliance of Tudor London, a guy named William Gilbert, who coined the term electricity in English, figured out the Earth was a spinning magnet, was friends with Francis Bacon. I think he was Bacon's doctor. A lot of doctors back then were scientists. And Bacon apparently, hard to believe, told him, this magnetism thing you're into, Gilbert, I'd forget about it. I'd set that aside. So he completely whiffed on the most important scientific invention, which is electricity, which comes from spinning magnets inside copper coils and other things like that too.
Well, it's good that the Brits had Michael Faraday.
Yeah, can I just say this about the Brits? Because this is the conclusion I came to after my trip to London. I said this on my way home. I recorded it and put it out on my podcast. It's like the Brits are very, very smart and they don't wear it on their sleeve. And because the hidden life is best. And people say, oh, Japanese so smart, or the French intellectuals, or the Jews are the smartest, and I think they're the smartest. I would say no. No, it's the English and the Scots. Scots came up with a lot of this stuff. Faraday might have been Scottish. Um, that joint and the math, yeah, the math and the electricity and all this stuff came out of England, but nobody thinks of them as super smart. You don't think of the English as super smart. You think of them as polite. You think of them as, Empire or soccer or the Beatles. They're really, really smart. And And what Francis Bacon did is what we're going to get into, because science is just scratching the surface of Francis Bacon's accomplishments. And yeah, really, really smart
The
bunch of people.
Enlightenment, which was more or less created by philosophy becoming science, because
Yes.
science did ultimately, philosophy gave birth to science and then science ate it. But Nietzsche, when he declared God is dead, it wasn't a jubilant proclamation.
Right.
He was forlorn. And what
Yeah.
he felt killed science was the Enlightenment. And with Rene Descartes, I read the canon of Western philosophy because I was a philosophy major. The rationalists felt like the truth could be discerned from within. And then there was the empiricists like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, who were British, and they felt you could only discern the truth by measuring, by empiricism. And then Kant came along and brought them both together, which was an amazing accomplishment. But my philosophic training, Descartes was like the man. We knew about Bacon, but Descartes was the man, and he's the one that came up with cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And in with that statement leads to a joke that actually freshman philosophy students tell each other. When Descartes was at a cocktail party and he was asked if he wanted a drink, he said, "I think not." And then he disappeared. And that was the last we saw of Rene Descartes.
Poor guy. There's, there's a lesson there.
And then you posit that Bacon went on to found Freemasonry.
Here's a fun fact, Nick, that when you join Freemasonry, you're told you're going to become enlightened. And it's not a coincidence that the entire era, the Enlightenment era, coincides with the exact term that Freemasons use for themselves. It had an enormous impact on that era, and it's recognized by scholars. They'll talk about, the ideals of Freemasonry in the Enlightenment era. But that came from Bacon too, who's also known by scholars. Everything I'm saying is mainstream scholarship. We'll get to the gray area stuff in a little bit. But Bacon himself constantly referenced light in his writings, sometimes very oddly so. And so there are these connections. That's what I'm digging out and will be, putting into the book, or it's in the podcast as well, as like specific quotes of Bacon's that reference light in a kind of an extreme way, a poetic way, you might say, for a sciencey guy or a lawyer. Uh, it's it's pretty interesting, but some of this stuff is on I have a Substack and a Patreon. Most of the stuff is free. The stuff I write is almost all open. And you can find all these quotes that I'm not prepared to quote from memory right here, but there's a connection between light. Freemasons call themselves sons of light, and as well as sons of the widow, and light in Bacon, and then the Enlightenment. It's quite fascinating. And then if you go to London, everybody goes to the British Museum. Their room number one is called the Enlightenment Room. And it's a paean to data collection. Because really what inductive reasoning is centers on gathering of data to make your conclusion. And essentially what made the British Empire was the ability to look at a lot of data and draw conclusions, which is still the thing today, right? Like the tech wizards want your data. So the more data they have, the more knowledge they have, and the more power they have. And it seemed like the entire country heeded Bacon's call, which he never said explicitly. I'm not saying Bacon said, gather data, go forth and gather data. But it's essentially what it worked out to. In the Enlightenment Room, I have a whole post on this on Patreon. is a an homage. It's a temple of data. You just can't believe it. Like book after book after book from like rice fields of Ceylon or the mountainous region of northwest China. Little details of like every single part of the world brought back to London to be examined. And sure enough, you know, it didn't actually start right around that time, but very soon after. I mean, they did go to Jamestown during Bacon's lifetime and settle America. So you could say, yes, the British Empire started right there, and Francis Bacon was there and pushing it.
And he wrote a
And
book
it would be
called New
true.
Atlantis.
Now, New
Was
Atlantis is fascinating, absolutely fascinating, because what he did, this did not get published during his lifetime, but right after he died, 1626, this book was published, and he makes a prophecy in it. I feel it's a prophecy. It's a fable. It's actually science fiction. It's my friend Hans Schantz, the Ether Czar, said he's a science fiction author, and we're friends. He said, that book is science fiction, and it shocked me because, of course, that's exactly what it is. Where these English sailors stumble on a hidden island, a Shangri-La, if you will, that's based on science, and that's what they're all about. And it's the College of Solomon, the 6 days work, and they're actually run by science and scientists are carried around like kings. And what he did was prophesy the technocracy that we're living under today and that they want us to live under even more.
who's they?
Oh yeah, I can't say they. That the people with the most power, the bankers and the tech bros and the authoritarians, they want more data. So they want to study us further. And they pretty much have all the data they want, but they want more. They want people that say want to end cash, like the European Union is further down this road. Big surprise where the central bank digital currency. Whoever wants to put in central bank digital currency, which are the bankers, which came out of England too. Like London are the world's bankers. I mean, I sound a little nutty, but you can push almost everything that's happening today back to London and to Francis Bacon time. And one of them is banking. And that data gathering continues apace and which is akin to scientism, which I love to rag on Yuval Noah Harari, who is a high priest of scientism, who thinks the algorithm is God. There is no such thing as God. We made God. The algorithm is God, is a direct result of Baconian thinking. Now, of course, Bacon couldn't say that, and he had to appear to be a good Christian, and he had to write about religion because that was the time. It was just after that time, the Enlightenment, as Nietzsche says, killed God. Francis Bacon kickstarted the Enlightenment. Francis Bacon kickstarted atheism, I think, which you can't see directly in his writings because they would have strung him up. You had to go to church, you had to make your homage to Christianity back then. And if you were any sort of a public person, if you had any sort of position of power, it was only much later, I would say another 100 years, right? Like the 1720s with David Hume, and that even a whiff of atheism could be thought of as in any way respectable or a serious matter to even think about. They would imprison you and torture you if they thought you were an atheist in Tudor London, which is what happened to some of the playwrights, Thomas Kidd, even Christopher Marlowe. So it's all
Galileo
really,
had a tough time too when he came out and talked about heavenly bodies.
yeah. I mean, he didn't even dare to mention atheism by any stretch. Yeah. So the tension was just beginning right there between religion and science, and I think as Bacon predicted in New Atlantis, science is king or trying to become king. This is really why I did the podcast to talk about scientism and that people don't know that they're in the religion of scientism. that they unconsciously feel that science is the path forward for humanity and the only path forward to humanity, such that, the mantra during COVID was science will win and trust the science. Who was saying trust in God? It's really, really changed, and it's been a very slow change, exactly as Mr. Bacon said. It's going to take a long time, and to change, the minds of men. And I believe, and I'm tracking it now and setting it out, like set out to make science as a religion. And the proof, of course, as I said already, is in New Atlantis.
Well, science has certainly become the predominant religion, although people profess to be Christians, and a number of them are, but I think a lot of people have no idea of how science controls their life. I mean, science controls just about everything, especially in this day and age. You talk about Freemasonry and its genesis, and you say it's the Knights Templar. That was the genesis of Freemasonry. And also then Bacon got involved, or Bacon was the one that
Yeah.
was the catalyst between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry. Tell us about that?
Let me say one more thing on science and scientism, is that this idea that science is the way forward, they have to lie, because science, if you look at it truthfully,
Who's they?
um, the people who push science on us, let's
Okay.
say the large pharmaceutical companies that say science will win, they fudge data. Like, in order to make science a truly powerful, they have to lie. So what I say is scientism lives on lies, but you really need critical thinking and know something about science and how science works to dissect the lies that come at you, which science is supposed to be a bastion of truth. So that's an inversion, what I would call a Gnostic inversion. But anyway, it gets kind of difficult to talk about. Right. So if we go back to Freemasonry, Freemasonry was there at the start of science. So the Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge, which started under the aegis of Francis Bacon, there's proof of that. That's clear. That's mainstream science history. There were Freemasons at those first meetings. This is, again, mainstream history. Christopher Wren, the famous architect, was in the Royal Society. He was a Freemason. A Scottish guy named Robert Moray was at the very early meetings of the Royal Society. Scotsman, Freemason. And there's a fascinating confluence of Freemasonry and science that's very little known about. It's only been written about in the last 30 or 40 years. It's clearly true. It's clear to me, and that's part of my task, is to show how Bacon wanted that to happen and made it happen, but Freemasonry is not very scientific. It's much more emotional, psychological, mystery school, occulty. And yes, I did feel like I had to make a connection between Freemasonry and the Knights Templar, because it's been a rumor since Freemasonry announced itself to the world, which was on St. John's Day, which is June 24th, which is essentially the summer solstice. So we're back to light and the sun. Let's just say the summer solstice, 1717, which is a sort of a magic number. In London, the Freemasons said, "Yo, we be here. We exist. We are alive." And these four separate London lodges joined together, and very shortly after, there was a united Grand Lodge of England, and the above ground history of Freemasonry began, which is just another huge topic. Freemasonry is this enormous topic because it grew so substantially, and remarkably so. And I just felt like I had to show that the Knights Templar, who were squashed 400 years before, in 1314 was the end of the Knights Templar. So 1717 is 400 years later. Why are people saying it was the Knights Templar? And that's a really fascinating trail, which leads to another huge topic, which are the Knights Templar, which take you back to the Crusades, where the European nobles went to the Middle East, to the Holy Land, as they call it, and conquered Jerusalem and held Jerusalem for almost 100 years between 1100 and 1200. And the Knights Templar were a major part of that. They weren't the only part of it. They were just a part of that crusading effort. But they were stationed in Gaza and in a Israeli town called Acre and Jerusalem. Like all the hot spots right now in the news right now, the Knights Templar were there. And the symbolism of Solomon's Temple. So the Knights Templar were headquarters were at Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, which still exists. It's where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is today. It's an enormous amount of controversy around that tiny bit of property in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, which was built by King Herod. King Herod improved it. That's a whole topic, the history of Solomon's Temple. And Solomon's Temple figures hugely with the Templars because that was their full name, the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. Freemasonry, the Temple of Solomon, is a key symbol for them in their third degree initiation, where their architect, their Jesus, this Hiram Abiff, is the architect for Solomon's Temple. And Francis Bacon references Solomon a lot in his writings. So there's definitely a connection there. So I felt it very important to show how very, very likely it is that the Knights Templar became the Freemasons. And it's too complicated to go in now. It's my Substack has it, two or three in-depth articles on how that happened. But to me, it's there's overwhelming, as I say in the article that I just finished, circumstantial evidence, like the correspondences between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry are, there's just too many to ignore. There's too many to be a coincidence. It just doesn't happen like that. But it's not like Knights Templar equal Freemasonry because there's a lot more went into Freemasonry than just, Knights Templar stuff. But they play a huge role in it. And it's quite a detective story that I feel like not just because of me, but some other writers have put this information together that it's kind of become like, yeah, the Knights Templar became the Freemasons. And, basically people have been saying that since the Masons went public, what is it, 1717? It's 300 years ago. So we're 700 years from the Knights Templar getting squashed by the French king, and we're 300 years from the birth of Freemasonry, and it's still a major part of today's world. It's pretty fascinating.
I've talked about the Knights Templar twice previously on my podcast, once with Peter Lavenda, and he felt that the Masons definitely came out of the Knights Templar. And with a retired history professor, Rick Spence, who was quite knowledgeable in these areas on the occult, and he was, I think, somewhat agnostic on it.
Mainstream scholarship says no, that there's no evidence. Occultists say yes. They like immediately go for it. What I did was take the mainstream scholarship with the occult interest in it, and I tried to take out the more fantastical elements because the occultists think the Templars found the Ark of the Covenant while doing excavations on the Temple Mount and brought it to America and buried it somewhere. And they learned secrets of alchemy from the Sufis and the Gnostics, and they have these secret, powers. And the scholars are like, there's two branches. The Knights Templar went south and became Gnostic and did weird things at their initiations. Or they're like, the Knights Templar were totally fine. They just got screwed over by the French king. What's the true story? I think we can discount almost completely that the Knights Templar discovered any real powerful alchemy or, it even goes to the Grail. Joseph Arimathea brought the Grail and the whole Dan Brown thing, and the Knights Templar are protecting the bloodline of Jesus in Europe. These kind of preposterous theories develop. And let's just say it, no evidence at all. They were on the Temple Mount. There's no evidence they excavated. All of this stuff can be tossed aside. And then were they really heretics? Did they do uh, homosexual initiations? Did they spit on the cross? Were they secret Gnostics? Is something to really take seriously because that's a philosophical outlook that definitely could have, let's say, infected the Templars because it was in that area, especially with the assassins. That's a fascinating bit of history, is the assassins were a real group of Muslims that actually were more closely allied with the Templars than fighting them because the assassins were a rogue Muslim group fighting Saladin, who who put a world of hurt on the Templars before they were driven out later by another Muslim group. So that could have actually happened. And then the whole story of, did they do secret initiations and spit on the cross was generally accepted as true. And now there's just a spate of new, very scholarly, university trained books that are trying to paint the Templars as innocent. Some almost completely innocent of any wrongdoing.
And
It,
that was because Philip the Fair owed them a lot of money. I mean, that's the explanation now.
uh,
And he
yes, that's
decided, well,
correct.
I don't want to pay them, so I'll just kill them. Kind of a
Yes,
mafia thing.
and that's correct. He did owe them a lot of money. But they also were very much hated by anyone because they were rich and they were very haughty. They were very superior, which is a hallmark of Gnosticism. And they were pretty inept in their dealings in the Holy Land. And let's face it, they lost. They got driven out of the Holy Land. And what's their purpose? That was their whole purpose. And people were sick of the Crusades and they were trying to get another Crusades. They didn't read the writing on the wall. The writing on the wall was like, look, you guys got to join with the Knights Hospitallers. You guys are finished. Let's redo this whole thing. Let's rethink this whole thing. And they were resisting that. They were trying to raise money for the Crusades. And they were ripe for the picking because they only owed allegiance to the Pope. So they had thousands of pieces of property in France, but they paid no taxes. They didn't even tithe to the church. And this was true everywhere throughout Europe. They were only loyal to the Pope, but the Pope, the whole church was in a shambles. I can't speak in detail with that, but the church was actually in Avignon. It had left Rome. And there was a lot of mistrust in the church because of the simony and selling indulgences and there, it, was- it was a very different time. And Philip the Fair saw his chance,
And he was the
and it
king of
was like
France at the
he
time.
was the
So,
king. Yeah, Philip the Fair or Philip the Fourth was the king of France, and he had so much power that he arrested something like 2,000 Templars in one night, one day, and they never got out of the situation, which they could have if they had, and very few were actually killed. He burned 54 of them at the stake in 3012 en masse. 30 of them died under torture. And then finally, Jacques de Molay, the very famous Templar, was burned very near Notre Dame. It wasn't right in front of Notre Dame, but it was actually on the island there. If anyone's been to Paris, there's the cathedral sits on an island. And that was the famous end of the Templars. But I'm not saying, it was a lot. I mean, about like 56 were burned in France, nowhere else. No Templars got burned anywhere else. And the rest, some went to monasteries, but a lot of places they just changed their name, especially in Portugal. There was a huge Templar presence in Portugal. They just changed their name to the Order of Christ and carried on. And guess what? Portugal became the first empire in Europe. The Portuguese Empire was the first major empire in Europe since the Roman Empire. And it's obviously because the Templars never folded. They kept their wealth and kept their shipping and carried on. And so all these rumors that they never found the wealth in the Paris Temple with the headquarters. They never found all the Templar ships. The Templars had become masters of shipping. Probably went to Portugal. Rumors are they went to Ireland and Scotland as well, which I think are true. It's just too much circumstantial evidence.
Rosslyn Chapel.
And then the Rosslyn Chapel plays in. That's been overplayed. Makes great, good for movies, good for Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which has all these absurd Jesus's bloodline and Merovingian bloodline, and Dan Brown made that into a story. So the Rosslyn Chapel is overplayed, but it's definitely a part of it because the Sinclair family, which people will recognize as a powerful international family, did build Rosslyn Chapel, and they were up in the Orkney Islands, which is where the very first Freemason lodge is, and they became the heads of the first Freemason lodges in Scotland, which are connected to James the First. They were given, what's the word? They rulers, or they were the head of the charters. James the First actually did charter Masons guilds into the very first Freemason lodges. There is a beginning to Freemasonry in Scotland. And I'm just trying to track that into London with Francis Bacon. But what happened is finally, in the last 30 years, real scholarship happened on Freemasonry. Two books, one, Scotland's Century by a guy named Stevenson. I think it's Richard Stevenson or Douglas Stevenson. Really broke open a logjam of Masonic scholarship with real, paperwork and detective work. And he said, same as this other gal who wrote a great book, that there was so much myth and legend and what's the correct word, Nick? Hogswoggle. I'm forgetting the technical term for the largesse of nonsense surrounding the origins of Freemasonry, like King Solomon was our first Freemason, or Euclid started Freemasonry in ancient Greece. That serious scholarship wasn't done on Freemasonry. Well, this Mr. Stevenson and Scotland's Century and Builders of Empire by oh gosh, what's her name? Harlan Jacobs, Jessica Harlan Jacobs, Builders of Empire, Freemasonry, 1717 to 1929. Very, very detailed look at Freemasonry and how it actually created globalism. So what we're living through right now, globalism, would be directly from Freemasonry. So we get Enlightenment and then we get globalism, which scholars have tied to Freemasonry. So those are two fabulous books that I
Her,
should
her
send you
book was
links
published
to.
by an academic press, right?
Both of them were.
Okay.
Hers by Princeton and his by St. Andrews in Scotland, like the top university in Scotland. They're very rigorous books. They're very scholarly. They don't even mention the Knights Templar. They don't even go there. They don't have to. But they've really pegged a lot of information on Freemasonry that's very solid. They've demystified the origins of Freemasonry to a large degree, and I've kind of taken it on myself to try to demystify the last piece, the last mile. Like, how did it get from Scotland to London? Which
And
is where
you're thinking
I
that that was Francis Bacon.
I'm saying that's Francis Bacon, and I have some good evidence for that, Nick.
Let's hear it.
Evidence is in Shakespeare. As far as I can tell, the earliest sustained evidence Symbolism, public symbolism of Freemasonry is in the plays of William Shakespeare. And guess who is the secret author of William Shakespeare, Nick?
Bacon. I just want to say this about the Freemasons before we jump into
Sure,
Shakespeare.
sure.
I believe you say that the Freemasons founded the Hellfire Club.
Yes.
Now, there were two incarnations of the Hellfire Club. One was the Duke of Wharton from 1721 to 1746, and the other one was Sir Francis Dashwood in
Yeah.
the mid 1740s. Did they found both those?
I think they both were Freemasons. I'm positive the first one was. And he wasn't just a Freemason, he was very high ranking. I just read this and I can't recall the exact name. He might have been the Grand Master of Freemasonry. So the date you just gave is right after Freemasonry announced itself to the world. And he became Grand Poobah, and he's the guy that started the Hellfire Club. So this idea that the Knights Templar were up to no good and doing, kind of perverted stuff at their initiations carries over to the very beginnings of public Freemasonry and the Hellfire Club, being up to no good. And the second guy, Dashwood, I do believe he was a Freemason, but I wouldn't bet my house on that. But as I recall, yes, they're both Freemasons.
George the First shut down the first Hellfire Club because it was, quote, filled with horrid impieties, unquote. So George the First thought that what they were doing was nefarious. And
Yeah.
when you get into Sir Francis Dashwood, the Hellfire Club moves into the caves of Wycombe
Yeah.
Hill. And in those caves, there's pagan gods and phallic symbols, and I think some very heavy duty debauchery and
Yeah.
irreverence. Fill us in on that.
Well, I can't really speak to that. That came out of my Templar research, but that's the kind of stuff the Templars were accused of. And that's why I popped it into that essay, but I haven't dug into that. I have read about that previously, but basically what you said. I mean, they were up to no good. I've got a book on it here, I think somewhere. I think our Benjamin Franklin got involved with them, and there's been some very disturbing archaeological finds from some of the places they met. They had some spin-off lodges. It seems like there's always a group up to some serious perverted stuff, and at that time it would have been the Hellfire Club. Uh, right after, there's the Gilles de Rais in France, which is after the Templar time. There were stuff with the Templars. The assassins were up to no good. You go back further, some of the Gnostic groups, the Ophite groups, it's the exact same accusations that were made against the early Ophites from a number of people.
And
And
who are
so
the Ophites,
the
Robert?
Ophites are considered the first Gnostic group of any real size, and they're thought to have their Gnostic philosophy were thought to have infected the Templars and continue into the Masons, which is something that I'm tracking because I do believe that Francis Bacon is Gnostic and that his science is Gnostic and that scientism ultimately is Gnostic and that not they're not complete atheists, but they think that the world was created by a false god, an evil demiurge. This is real. I know it sounds crazy, but this is what Gnostics believe, that the world is here to trap our souls, and that you're almost bound to rebel then. And you can rebel either by refusing to partake in the world, as some Gnostic groups do. The Cathars were like that. The Perfecti, they live very simple lives, no meat, no sex, pure lives. And then they would bless you right before you die. So you would then escape this world. You wouldn't have to be reincarnated here. The Gnostics believed in reincarnation. Or they defiled this world. They believed that their mission in life was to defile this false creation. And so the Gnostics are another huge area of research that I've been involved in. It's really, really fascinating, especially if you're interested in religion. There's a ton of interest in the Gnostics now. There's a resurgence. There's kind of a hipster Gnosticism. Uh, and it kind of started with Elaine Pagel's book in 1979 and the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Gospels in Nag Hammadi in 1949. But the Gnostics were known about throughout history. Plotinus wrote a book against the Gnostics. And Plotinus was a Neoplatonist philosopher who thought the world was mere flesh and you should reject the world. But he hated the Gnostics because he's like, what's wrong with you guys? The world's still beautiful, still a good place. It's just that the soul is more perfect and beautiful than the world. So Plotinus, who lived a very abstemious life, wrote against the Gnostics. And the Romans wiped them out, but they hid. They came back with the Bogomils and the Cathars, and it's an undercurrent of Gnosticism in the West since the birth of Jesus Christ. The very first Gnostic is thought to be Simon Magus, who's in the Bible in the Acts of the Apostles. Magus is magician. Gnostics are very closely associated with magic and the occult and alchemy because they want power, which ties into Francis Bacon. Knowledge is power, science. Chemistry comes from alchemy, science. Gnostics wanting power to overcome the limitations of the world. And we tie into all kinds of modern ideas and philosophy, that a man can become a woman. That's kind of part of alchemy. A woman can be a man. That was a core kind of principle of alchemy. It's not new, there's nothing new under the sun. But I do think that this Gnostic idea that the world is evil by an evil God there's a breach in the history of our religious ideas. It seems to me that that is something definite, that is something new, that is something very ugly. It leads to some very ugly behavior. And I do think that Gnosticism led to scientism and that Francis Bacon created a new kind of Gnosticism, which is a hallmark of Gnosticism, is that it's a very creative religion. There's all these different groups
Well, with
or sects,
Gnosticism, you liberate yourself with knowledge.
just
So
like Francis Bacon
getting
said.
back to Bacon,
Yeah,
knowledge is power.
yep,
You're
exactly.
not liberated through love,
No,
loving your fellow man, but you're
right,
liberated through
exactly.
knowledge,
Well
regardless
said.
of how you treat your fellow man.
Well said. They actually think, again, it's like so crazy, but they think they can become as gods. They actually challenge
And we're
God.
talking Gnostics, not they, right?
Gnostics think they can be God. To me, it's just completely crazy, but it's a very real thing. And there's a lot of proud Gnostics running around. I haven't actually talked to them. I've been invited on a couple Gnostic podcasts. There's a lot of proud young Gnostics out there. And that's a whole other topic of conversation, but
So we're
very,
dealing with
very,
Gnostic
very
chic,
fascinating. Gnostic sheep?
Gnostic chic, with
Oh,
the
yeah,
hipster
good. Yeah,
Gnostic movement.
absolutely.
In Theosophy, a number of people have come out of Theosophy and said that Jesus was a conspiracy, that Josephus created Josephus, the Jewish philosopher historian, who had actually become part of the Roman Empire or got really close with some Roman emperors, created Christianity to quell any kind of rebellion from the Israelis. And you talked about so Josephus was the guy that wrote the Gospels. But you talk about all those Gospels being found at Nag Hammadi in 1947. And I think that in and of itself eradicates what what Theosophy and is saying about Josephus writing the New Testament.
100% agree with you. Yeah, I think that's a crackpot idea.
So Shakespeare, Robert wasn't the only one to think that Bacon wrote Shakespeare. Actually, arguably the greatest writer in America or ever in our country, Mark Twain, he wrote Is Shakespeare Dead?, in which he posited that Francis Bacon was indeed Shakespeare.
Correct. Correct. You sure you want to go here, Nick? Because this gets really crazy.
Well, let's what did Bacon or what did Twain mean by that?
Okay. Anybody interested in this? There's a great video. Uh, a guy with a PhD in theater, Keir Cutler, who one day was like, I've got a PhD in literature, and I never heard that there's this huge controversy surrounding the fact that it looks like William Shakespeare could not possibly have written the William Shakespeare plays because the real William Shakespeare never went to school. He couldn't write. That's a whole other thing, the actual controversy over the Shakespeare authorship question. As far as Bacon being suspected to be the real William Shakespeare, that literally goes back to the very first poem ever published under the name of William Shakespeare. It's called Venus and Adonis. And back in the day, uh, poetry was like songs are today for us. People wrote a poem and then someone would write an answer poem. Like there's answer songs, if you know anything about modern songwriting and culture of songwriting. And somebody wrote a poem right after Venus and Adonis came back, again in that veiled language of Tudor poetry, accusing Francis Bacon of writing it, the very first Shakespeare poem. So it started right there. And you can follow this trail. But then in the 1860s, a woman named Delia Bacon, an American woman who was involved in the theater, was a writer. It hit her one day, like it hit me one day when I realized Bacon was much more than Shakespeare. He was Shakespeare, but much more. It just hits you. She was like, "There's no way these plays were meant for popular consumption in Tudor London, and there's no way Shakespeare wrote them." And she published a 700-page book, something like The Philosophy of the Plays of William Shakespeare. And she set off a firestorm in America. And that's how Twain found out about it. Uh, she was a brilliant woman, extraordinarily courageous. She was so brilliant, she once won a short story contest. She beat Edgar Allan Poe in a short story contest.
That's pretty good.
She wrote this great book. She convinced Nathaniel Hawthorne. She was friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Walt Whitman said she's the greatest thing, in America. She's the female
And
star of
sliced
America.
bread.
Yeah, he didn't quite say that. He meant to say that.
And
She turned a lot of people onto this and it just set it off. It's never stopped since then. It just never made academia. Like academics just discounted it right off the bat because their careers were invested. They already had analyzed all these plays as if a guy from Stratford upon Avon had written them. And it's finally broken down. Like I heard about it, probably because of the internet, probably because I heard about this on a podcast probably 10 years ago now. And I was like, what? There's no manuscripts of any of the plays or poems. There's no evidence he could write. There's 6 signatures three of which are on his last will and testament, and they look like he couldn't handle a pen. His daughter didn't know how to write. His father didn't know how to write. There's no evidence he ever went to school. And they've turned England literally upside down and shaken every drawer and every cabinet looking for any clue that William Shakespeare actually wrote the plays, and they can't find it. They haven't found it. And I sent you a link to the other thing. Anyone interested in this would be to watch Diana Price, who was always a regular Shakespeare lover, and she got wind of this, and she said, "Well, let me see what we know about any of the other playwrights." And she wrote a great book, um, which I detailed to you, New Questions in the Shakespeare Authorship world, and she showed that we have evidence for everyone else writing the plays except for William Shakespeare. And that's another huge topic. The one I would suggest people watch, it's a fantastic YouTube video, free, a feature-length documentary that's brilliantly done. It's called Seven Steps to Mercy. And it will give you the whole background on the Shakespeare authorship controversy and why this brilliant Norwegian guy, Peter Amundsen, thinks Francis Bacon wrote the plays. And the history of that is fascinating because Francis Bacon was a spy and he wrote things in code. So a huge bunch of Baconians started looking for secret codes in Shakespeare, and they made themselves look foolish and finding all kinds of things written in code, which I don't get into that at all because I think you can make that into anything. It's kind of like a Rorschach test. But Peter Amundsen is a code guy, but he goes through the hardcore evidence step for step that Bacon wrote the plays. And there's a smoking gun discovered in around 1880 by a Francis Bacon scholar named William Spedding, James Spedding, who wrote the collected work of Francis Bacon. So he was gathering up every scrap of paper on Bacon, his letters, his books, his unpublished manuscripts. He wrote a 14-volume collected works. He found in the British Library a notebook in Francis Bacon's hand, handwritten. It's called the Promus, which means storehouse in Latin. And in the Promus notebook are 1,500 handwritten little proverbs, sayings, ideas that a writer might keep. You know, writers carry around notebooks and jot down ideas. And of these 1,500 jottings, there's 600 direct correspondences to Shakespeare plays. Some very famous ones, like "To thine own self be true" is in that notebook. "All's well that ends well" is in that notebook. And they have been detailed in a few places. It's a real smoking gun only because there's hundreds of other correspondences between Bacon and Shakespeare that if you're open-minded and you're serious, you have to at least say that Bacon was involved in writing these plays. And when you get further into it, you would say, as I say, I think that he was the head of a group of writers that wrote these plays. And then that's another whole thing because what created the Shakespeare mythos was this book called The First Folio. And if you learn about the First Folio, you are a budding Shakespeare scholar because what they did is put all his plays into one book. It was published in 1623, 3 years before Bacon died. Uh, Fully like 18 years after the Earl of Oxford died. He couldn't have done it. Bacon was right there. Ben Jonson helped him do it. Ben Jonson wrote part of it. And they hint that William Shakespeare wrote the plays from Stratford. It's still very vague. They say William Shakespeare wrote them, but they don't say anything else about his life.
When I was an
And
undergrad, I had heard that Bacon had written Shakespeare. I didn't stop and take a hard look at it because I was kind of tackling the critique
kind
of
of
pure
kind
reason.
of busy.
So I just kind of filed it away. And you sent me a very interesting article that was published by Oxford University Press. And it's actually very shocking. that that Queen Elizabeth signed warrants in Tudor England that allowed theater bosses to capture children for their theater companies, which I found to be quite horrific.
Yeah. Well, this is the real dark underbelly of the Tudor theater scene, is that it seemed to involve human trafficking and pedophilia, which comes as a shock because we think of the pretty music and nice fabrics of the Tudors. But pedophilia was rife around the theaters. One reason was because they had prepubescent boys playing the female roles. And a lot of these roles are very sexualized. They're very sexual, even if they're kind of hidden behind slang. And the boys would leave home and have to live with the theater managers and stuff. There's a book on that I read before I realized the pedophilia angle called Squeaking Cleopatras, because they had to get boys whose voice hadn't broken yet, so they could sound like a woman, and they were wearing women's clothes. So gosh, and they're away from home, goodness me. And Francis Bacon was homosexual, and his brother Anthony was, and there's an undercurrent of that in Tudor London. And so right after Bacon's lifetime was the Oliver Cromwell Puritan Revolution, where they grabbed James' son Charles and cut off his head. And one of the first things they did was shut down the theaters. And people say, "Oh, that's because, they were tight asses and they didn't like art and they didn't like theater." Well, no, they didn't like the pedophilia that everyone knew was happening. And that's one reason they shut the theaters down. I'm sure they didn't like the tone of some of the entertainment. I would imagine they still allowed some theater that they approved of. I don't know. I haven't had time to really get into that, but I have seen that they shut it down because it was an open secret about the pedophilia in the theater scene. And so that, again, like I've been saying, these are contemporary problems that were front and center there. And yeah, and then to see that Queen Elizabeth signed a charter is really, really fascinating. But they had to get the king to agree to everything back then, which goes back to Freemasonry and the Royal Society, is that the king approved of those groups. They had to. There couldn't really be a secret group. And if there was, they'd be arrested and locked up because they would think they're plotting to overthrow the king, because that's the history of England, is the history of kings being overthrown. But anyway, so yeah, it sort of makes sense that she signed that charter, and she had the image of the Virgin Queen, but that's not what she was, and it's not what anyone was. It's the hidden life is best. They create false labels for themselves. They create a label and stick to
And
that.
who's they? The
That would be them, like Francis Bacon create the label of the Freemasons as a fraternal society. So it would be the inner core of the Tudors would really stuck to this thing that she's the Virgin Queen, which ties in nicely to Christianity because they have, a Virgin Queen leading them. And these labels are created by the power brokers. And the funny thing is, today we don't really know who the power brokers were. In Tudor London, you knew who they were. They were the king and they were the Privy Council and they were the dukes and the earls and the lords. There weren't very many of them, maybe 50. There were very few and they were extremely powerful. And they squabbled. They fought each other. Sir Walter Raleigh lost his head. The Earl of Essex lost his head. So fascinating stories going on, and the theater figured into a lot of this. A lot of the lords and the earls had their own theater groups. The guy who started MI5, Francis Walsingham, had his own theater group because actors make the best spies. Spies really are actors on stage 24/7. So it was this, and actors travel and they get intelligence. And actors in those days were called intelligencers. And essentially, if you left London, especially if you went to Europe, you were engaged and expected to bring back intelligence. And everyone was spying on everyone all the time, partly because they were always trying to overthrow the king, partly because of the tension between the Protestants and the Catholics. So it was this incredible pressure cooker, which created the greatest spies ever, which are, the British intelligence. They're tremendous because, like I said before, they're incredibly smart and they're incredibly paranoid and they're incredibly power hungry. The empire didn't happen by accident. It was very much a product of forethought and planning and Machiavellian intrigue. And Mr. Bacon was right there at the center of it. And what's fascinating is theater figured into it to a large degree, consciously, not accidentally. The history plays of Shakespeare, this is mainstream normie scholarship, Shakespeare scholarship, are Tudor propaganda. He was writing Tudor propaganda. And another recommendation, this might be my highest recommendation because it's so enjoyable. It's a 2022 film called The Lost King by British comedian Steve Coogan. And I don't know the actress's name, but she plays a real woman who's alive today named Philippa Langley, who discovered the bones of Richard III, which is the subject of a Shakespeare play, who he makes look like Hitler. He actually was a pretty decent guy, but they demonized him because Henry VII, the first Tudor king, Elizabeth's grandfather, deposed Richard III in a bloody battle. But he had a very tenuous bloodline to the king. Like you had to at least have a bloodline to become king. Henry VII really kind of didn't. He quickly married a woman who did, and then the propaganda began that Richard III was evil. So thank God we got these Tudors in the house, y'all. And and they purposely wrote propaganda to bolster the regime. Imagine that. Can you imagine that happening today, Nick?
No, it wouldn't happen today.
That's what I mean. It all connects to today, all of this stuff.
Richard III definitely has a bad rap. One of the best plays I've ever seen, if not the best, was Richard III. But
No kidding.
there's a society out there that actually says, and a bunch of people that actually say that Richard III got a bad rap.
They're the ones that found his bones. That's what the movie's about, that group. It's an
Okay.
incredible story. Incredible. The Lost King.
And you have a very unorthodox take on a number of Shakespeare plays. Give us your unorthodox take on Midsummer Night's Dream.
Okay, so I'm writing about this now. I did one podcast, part one, and I called it A Midsummer Night's MK Ultra because it figures with sexual trauma, lost time, drugging, complete change of personality after being given drugs. Looks like human trafficking.
Give us an
And
overview. Give us an overview. Let's
okay,
shoehorn
so it's
Midnight
one of the
Summer's
most
Dream into a
okay.
couple paragraphs.
It's one of the most famous plays of all time, most popular plays of all time. It's confusing, I think, by design, but what happens is these two young couples get lost in the woods and they're set upon by Oberon and Puck. And Oberon is the king of the fairies, and he's married to the queen of the fairies, Titania. And it actually starts with overhanging all this is the looming wedding of the Duke of Athens and his bride, Hippolyta, who's the queen of the Amazons. So it ties into Greek myth right away. but it's set in the time of, say, ancient Athens. And these young lovers get lost in the woods, and Puck and Oberon play with their heads using drugs, using a magical potion made from a flower. And for no reason at all, Puck changes an actor. So the third plot line, there's Puck and Titania and Oberon. There's the four young lovers, and there's a troupe of actors doing a play within a play, all in the woods that night. And very strange things happen. It's sort of dreamlike, but not really dreamlike. It, to me, is clearly, they're playing with these kids' heads, and this poor actor named Bottom, his head, he gets turned into an ass. Get it? Bottom gets turned into an ass. And what's really creepy, and to me, new to Shakespeare, not anymore, but it was really horrifying. First of all, the treatment of the women was really, really horrifying, but especially Oberon has his wife using his magic sleep with the donkey. So there's very overt bestiality, except he's not really a donkey. He's a guy with a donkey head, but there's references to bestiality throughout the play. It's really creepy, and all kinds of weird kind of sexual energy is going on, but somehow the play gets thought of to be about love and marriage because there's a wedding looming, but nobody gets married. And the only people married in the play are Oberon, King of the Fairies, and Titania, Queen of the Fairies. And guess what the central conflict in the play is? That Titania is taking care of a boy, and Oberon wants the boy. Give me the boy is the central conflict. So for someone like me, I'm like, what? Why does Oberon want a boy? But nobody asked that question. It's not answered in the play. He just wants the boy for a henchman. And get this, Titania wants the boy because she promised one of her devotees who died during childbirth, she promised this woman, I'll take care of your boy, don't worry. And now Oberon wants to take the boy. She won't give the boy up. So there's chaos, it's causing bad weather and storms and floods. What does Oberon do to get the boy? He tortures his wife by making her fall in love with a donkey and they have sex. And in the play, it's slightly kind of muted that they had sex. It's only hinted about, symbolized, they sleep. But in all the new movies, there's like really graphic interspecies sex, especially the Michelle Pfeiffer, Kevin Kline 1999 version. It's like I watched that first. Not a very good version. I'm like, what am I watching? I'm watching an animal and a beautiful woman have sex. Like, what's wrong with this freaking play? And this has happened to me a few times in these plays. And this one, especially Romeo and Juliet, and this play. And then what really blows my mind is, okay, you got to go read all the criticism over the centuries, and nobody talks about it. Until now, until the 20th century, people start to bring out these really creepy, quote, transgressive, that's the hip word, the hip academic word, it's transgressive. They'll start to explore it, but not overtly because you cannot criticize Shakespeare as a playwright. Because if Shakespeare did it in the religion of academia, it's by definition good. So there must be something good about it. And if you criticize it, you're you're a Philistine and a cement head, and you obviously don't understand it. But digging, and I nearly gave up, but digging and digging, I found a student paper that supported my point of view that it's extremely misogynistic, this play. And then digging again, there is this one Shakespeare scholar who's from Poland. His name is Jan Kott, and he writes about the cruelty of this play. It's just extraordinarily cruel play that somehow has been known as a nice play for children because it's got fairies in it. This is what happens with Shakespeare is that there's a huge hidden dark underbelly to Shakespeare that goes almost completely unspoken that I've found in the 6 or 7 plays that I've done a deep dive into. It's really shocking. So Midsummer Night's Dream, I'm in the middle of examining it. The first one was how Oberon mistreats his wife Titania, the only married couple in the play. And this part two will be like what happens to the couples and the two young women, what happens to them in the play, who are great friends at the start of the play, and they wind up, scratching each other's eyes out during the night. It's supposed to be funny. I found it quite horrifying. And I'm not that much of a prude. I can laugh at some crude humor, but this stuff is like, at least let's talk about it. At least let's talk about like how dark and ugly this play is, but you cannot find it. And I'm just to be sure, I'm reading the introduction to the third edition of the Art in Shakespeare. Like there's so much Shakespeare scholarship out there. You could literally fill a whole library with just books about Shakespeare. And they write these incredibly long introductions. This one's over 100 pages. And I'm going to go through it again just to make sure that no mainstream scholar is pointing out how like incredibly cruel and dark and ugly this play is. And like I'm saying, that Oberon wants the boy. Oh, by the way, he gets the boy. Titania gives up the boy, which is sort of hidden in the play. She never goes, all right, take the boy. I had enough with this donkey. It just like he slyly mentions to Puck. So Puck is this spirit. He's not a fairy. He's something else. He relates to some dark English, spirit lore. Uh, Oberon at some point says to Puck, "Yeah, she gave me the boy." So Oberon gets the boy, and the kids wake up and they don't know what happened to them. So there's this whole missing time element that we hear about from people with dissociative identity disorder. It's just mind blowing, Nick.
Well, Robert, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast. This has been a very elucidating hour and a half.
It's been a real pleasure, Nick. Very nice to meet you and hang out with you.
Absolutely. Have yourself a good night.
All right, you too. Take care now.